This is Women Road Warriors with Shelley Johnson and Kathy Tuccaro. From the corporate office to the cab of a truck, they're here to inspire and empower women in all professions. So gear down, sit back, and enjoy.
Welcome. We're an award-winning show dedicated to empowering women in every profession through inspiring stories and expert insights. No topics off limits on our show. We power women on the road to success with expert and celebrity interviews and information you need. I'm Shelley.
And I'm Kathy.
According to UN Women, 1 in 3 women will experience violence or sexual abuse at least once in their lifetimes. Violence against women and girls continues to be a terrible scourge even in the 21st century. Every Woman Treaty is a nonprofit committed to ending this. They're a global coalition of over 4,000 women's rights advocates and organizations in 169 nations advancing a treaty to end violence against women and girls. With us today is Lisa Shannon, the co-founder of Every Woman Treaty and chief of Global Diplomatic Campaign. She's worked in domestic violence shelters and conducted field research on gender in India, Russia, Somalia, Iraq, Guatemala, Kenya, and Congo. She founded Run for Congo Women and co-founded the first sexual violence crisis center in Mogadishu, Somalia. Lisa is the author of Mama Coco and the 100 Gunmen and 1,000 Sisters, which won the Independent Publishers Association Gold Award in 2010 for Best Book in Current Events and Foreign Affairs. Lisa is a true champion for women and girls, and we're honored to feature her and talk about Every Woman Treaty. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me and for your amazing work.
Thank you, Lisa. That means a lot.
This is exciting. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh my God, this is something that really is dear to my heart, and I'm excited about this conversation.
Yes. We can't thank you enough for what you're doing. Your work has made tremendous strides to champion the cause of women and girls. Before we talk about what your organization does and is accomplishing, could you maybe let our listeners know some stats on violence? I think too many times it's out of sight, out of mind. I think a lot of people would be very stunned that it's a lot more common than people think.
Absolutely. You just cited the World Health Organization statistic that 1 in 3 women are survivors of intimate partner violence or sexual assault, minimum. Those were statistics actually that were collected prior to the COVID pandemic, where there was a tremendous spike in rates of violence against women, intimate partner violence. And with the advent of technology-enabled violence, there has also been a spike. And then, of course, with all of the conflict that's happened around the world and climate emergencies as populations are moving as refugees, rates of violence rise. And so when we say 1 in 3 women are affected, that is really a minimum, and it doesn't include all manner of forms of violence, like, for instance, female genital mutilation, etc. So it's safe to say that all of us know someone very close to us, if it's not ourselves, who are survivors of this violence, and that violence against women affects 100% of humanity. I'll also say, and this is something that often gets kind of lost in the dialogue, that the impact reaches far beyond just the impact on the individual who suffers the violence. So mental health issues, substance abuse issues, higher suicide rates, et cetera, all flow from incidents of violence as well as missed work, et cetera. So, but if you look at a community as well, very often it ends up limiting children's access to school. So, for instance, you find in many areas, girls who may not have money for school fees are expected to effectively trade sex for access to school. A lot of girls won't go to school because they're afraid to use the bathrooms because it's too risky. drug and alcohol abuse more broadly, violent crime, all the way up to war. The rates of violence and how that's connected to violence in general in a particular country, and then conflict with neighbors or within the country, very tight connections there. So it has an impact on 100% of humanity and costs about 5% of the global economy as well. So trillions of dollars a year are being sunk in our failure to address violence against women and deliver a safe world for women and girls.
Wow. And this is happening
Wow.
in North America too, right?
Absolutely. This violence happens everywhere. There is no country, no culture that is immune. It manifests differently in different parts of the world. But for instance, in the United States on college campuses, it's estimated that a minimum of 1 in 5 women will be sexually assaulted. So yes, the rates of violence and the increase in violence is actually happening all over the world right now. And again, if you were to include, technology-enabled violence, cyber violence, there are some statistics that say it's something like 70% of young women who have experienced it.
Now, what is technology-enabled violence?
That is violence that's taking place online. It might be, for instance, if a girl has a boyfriend, is intimate with him, he might share photos of their intimate moments or pictures that she didn't approve, online harassment, cyber stalking.
Okay.
I'll share one story from Somalia. There was a girl who had a boyfriend of some kind. They were intimate in some way, I don't know, but he videotaped it and posted it on Facebook. And in Somalia, it's absolutely not okay for girls to be dating. So her father found out about it and he attempted to kill her. She ended up in the hospital. Her father came and picked her up from the hospital, took her home and burned her to death. She
Oh
was
my
murdered.
gosh.
And so
Oh my God.
and so
Wow.
when we say technology-enabled violence, there's violence that's happening in the online sphere that then can spill over for sure into the real world. But of course, the damage that is done in the form of technology-enabled violence, the psychological damage can be every bit as pronounced as something, that someone's experiencing physically.
Yeah.
Or to say there's no regulation for that whatsoever globally.
Right.
I know that I travel when I go to the Caribbean islands, for example. I I don't stay in these fancy posh resorts, right? I was like,
Mhm.
bring me to the hood, bring me where the people really need it. And I do cold calls ahead of time, and I'll go visit the women's shelters. I'll go visit they have young girl centers. They have homes where girls that are being raped, that have been raped, that have been removed from the families. And I've been to Barbados a few times, 3 times already. Spoken to the women in the shelters. They have a Jabi's house, which is a home where young girls who are prostituting themselves just to pay for education.
Yep.
And I've also been to the prison there many times. The island of St. Vincent has many homes for young girls. The island of Grenada, I've been there many times speaking to, I go to different schools and I create public events. And the amount of rapes that is going on those islands that the world doesn't see, because they're just going there for the resorts, right? They don't
Mhm.
see the dark side, the ugliness. I've been on TV a few times down there, just to be an advocate for these young girls, to be a voice. And I'm not just going to say the young girls, because there's young boys too, right? I went to a one place in Grenada where there was 30 young boys, and it's just heart wrenching. And I'm trying to do the best that I can to be that voice, so that these girls and boys, these children, learn to have a voice for themselves and try and break that dark circle of poison, because I call it poison,
Mhm.
of
It is
and
poison.
then
It's
Yeah.
it
poison.
is, and then it leads to sex trafficking, and then that's a whole other thing, right? So
Yeah.
it's awful. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, what beautiful work you have done there, and that breaking the silence absolutely is the first step. I mean, I think because in so many areas of the world, it's something that's just not talked about. Or there's so much shame associated with it that people are sort of brushing it under the rug. We can't deal with what we're not able to have a conversation about. And so
I'm going to say something. It's not just like we like to think that it's the men, right, that do this, but it is there was in the island of Trinidad, there was a young girl who was being raped by her father, and when she finally had the strength to tell her mother about it, well, her mother and her grandmother took her in the shower and washed her with cayenne pepper inside, and they
Oh my
were
God.
telling her that she was vile. Like, and I was with you remember Charmin Prince, Shelley, we
Yes.
interviewed her. She's
Yes.
from from Guyana, so her and I do this work, and we were in Grenada together, and we're getting this text from this young girl, and it was just like, oh my God, how horrific. So the grandmother and the mother were also involved in trying to silence this girl. So I know we like to blame men, but sometimes it's also a general brainwashing of everybody.
Sure.
You know.
So it's culturally ingrained, isn't it? In many
Well, I
cases.
think the culture of impunity has been ingrained around the world in various forms. But the hopeful thing here is that it is possible to address that. You know, I think that if you were to do some deep digging, you would see that, you know, women and men who are perpetrating this violence, it's not fundamentally who they are. That is learned behavior. And one of the incidents that I point to is, I don't know if y'all are familiar with the incident that happened at Stanford University several years back, where a young woman was passed out and a guy, Brock Turner, was raping her, and two young men were passing by and they saw it and they interrupted it, and a court case was pursued. It was a very light punishment for that young man. But the interesting thing is the two young men who interrupted the behavior, they were raised they were Scandinavian. And so it's interesting because they have prevention education programs in Scandinavia. So those young men were raised to believe that it was their duty to interrupt if they saw something like that happening. And prevention education programs are actually tremendously effective, can be tremendously effective in interrupting this cycle of violence and what we consider normal or acceptable, and can really shift the focus from victim blaming, doing bizarro things like you just described with the cayenne pepper, to focusing on how we relate to it when these incidents do come up. How do we communicate that it's unacceptable? How do we interrupt it? How do we raise young people to behave that way? And it doesn't take a huge percentage of the population to decide it's unacceptable to really start interrupting the cycle. And so, for instance, with prevention education, I think of an incident. I was in Guatemala interviewing women about the abuse that was happening there in indigenous communities, and the rates of incest or sexual violence with from family members were very, very, very high because women weren't given freedom of movement. Very often it was almost like false imprisonment, like they had to have a very compelling reason, like need to go to the doctor or something to even leave the house. And so I was conducting these interviews, and when we got home that night, my translator shared with me that when she was in fourth grade, her teacher had done this kind of good touch, bad touch curriculum with them and taught them about what's okay, what's not okay. And when she was 10 years old, that was fourth grade, at home, her father tried to rape her. But because she had done this curriculum and she knew it wasn't okay and she didn't have to go along with it, she interrupted it. And though she has no contact with her father to this day, she did manage to stop ongoing abuse because she had received that curriculum, right? So there are examples of that all over the world. And it's interesting because the message is different for boys and girls. With boys, what they seem to need to understand is that other men and boys will disapprove of the behavior if they engage in it. And so that's where things like training for police and judges, authority figures around preventing and interrupting violence have been very effective. And then, prevention education programs for young people between the ages of, say, roughly, 9 or 10 to 22 years old, that's an enormously effective intervention.
It really is. Yes.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for more of Women Road Warriors coming up.
Dean Michael, the tax doctor here. I have one question for you. Do you want to stop worrying about the IRS? If the answer is yes, then look no further. I've been around for years. I've helped countless people across the country, and my success rate speaks for itself. So now you know where to find good, honest help with your tax problems. What are you waiting for? If you owe more than $10,000 to the IRS or haven't filed in years, call me now at 888-557-4020 or go to mytaxhelpmd.com for a free consultation and get your life back.
Industry movement Trucking Moves America Forward is telling the story of the industry. Our safety champions, the women of trucking, independent contractors, the next generation of truckers, and more. Help us promote the best of our industry. Share your story and what you love about trucking. Share images of a moment you're proud of. And join us on social media. Learn more at truckingmovesamerica.com.
Welcome back to Women Road Warriors with Shelley Johnson and Kathy Tuccaro.
If you're enjoying this informative episode of Women Road Warriors, I wanted to mention Kathy and I explore all kinds of topics that will power you on the road to success. We feature a lot of expert interviews. Plus, we feature celebrities and women who've been trailblazers. Please check out our podcast at womenroadwarriors.com and click on our episodes page. We're also available wherever you listen to podcasts, on all the major podcast channels like Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Amazon Music, Audible, you name it. Check us out and bookmark our podcast. Also, don't forget to follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, YouTube, and other sites. And tell others about us. We want to help as many women as possible. Violence against women and girls affects 100% of humanity. The fact that it's a worldwide phenomenon in the 21st century is just a terrible thing. The trickle-down effect impacts everyone in a community. Rates of violence have a tight connection to war as well. Violence against women costs about 5% of the global economy. Every Woman Treaty is working to stop the violence around the world. They're a global coalition of over 4,000 women's rights advocates and organizations in 169 nations, advancing a treaty to end violence against women and girls. Lisa Shannon, the co-founder of Every Woman Treaty, has been giving us some very important information. Lisa, in our previous segment, you talked about prevention education. It really is effective. I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with the Babylonian encounter.
No.
It teaches good touch and bad touch. I was actually involved with that. It's about a little space alien that comes out of a bubble and learns good touch and bad touch. And we went to elementary schools.
Great.
I played bub, and I had to learn about good touch and bad touch, and I had to be trained. There were kids that came forward. We had different age groups from, age 5 up to the age 12, and we had social workers there, and I was amazed at the number of kids who came to me because they considered me more of a child, and they were telling me somebody was touching them. Our play resulted in 5 convictions.
Whoa.
Yeah. And
Wow.
Yeah.
That is exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That is an effective intervention.
Yeah. And I was shocked at some of the stats I'd learned just getting involved with that play on the amount of sexual abuse that was going on right in our backyards. It was just,
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'll share, for me, I got into this work. My first job out of college was working at a domestic violence crisis center. And then I got into doing the work for Congo, raising money for women in the Congo. And it was when I was about 35, I was speaking in the area I'm from, the Pacific Northwest, about violence against women in Congo, and people started sharing with me the trends around trafficking in this particular around the I-5 corridor in the Pacific Northwest. And as they were describing the recruiting process and the grooming process, my blood went cold because they were describing exactly what had happened to my sister when she was 14. And up until that point, even though I was working in the movement and talking about violence against women, the frame in my family had always been about my sister making bad choices at that time, not a predatory system that was targeting vulnerable young women and severely abusing them. And that's trauma that she's lived with, up until now. And so, it so often is much closer to home than we think.
Yeah.
I also learned recently, just in the last few years, my mom has been a real sort of, sister in arms with all of this. We've gone out and done lots of fundraising together, and she was always volunteering at Run for Congo Women events, et cetera, speaking out against the horrific attacks that were happening in Congo. And just a couple of years ago, I learned that she had been gang raped when she was 8 years old in front of her mother.
Oh my God.
Wow.
And this happened, her father was a military guy. He was stationed in the UK, and it happened in the UK. So it was interesting that she had never talked with me about that, even though we were busy going out and doing all this work for women and girls in the Congo and the horrific things they had lived through. And what she lived through was pretty similar to that, but had trouble even acknowledging that for herself. I'll remember when we were talking about it, I was like, Mom, have you ever sought therapy for this, et cetera? Because she was always doing self-help kind of things. And she was like, oh, Lisa, these sort of things happen to every girl. And I was like, wow, that's how deeply entrenched and internalized a lot of this stuff can be. So when people talk about intergenerational trauma now, I feel like I have a pretty deep understanding of that just in my bones. Knowing that's where my mom, had been coming from with this, and in her mind, it didn't even rise to the level that she would share that with me. So, I think, again, we're all sort of dealing with it, and it happens everywhere, and very much in our own backyard, very much in our own families. So as much as we'd love to be able to relate to this as a problem that's happening for, those people out there who may be on some, I don't know, different moral plane than we are, that's not the case. This is a human issue. It's a human issue, and it's cross-cutting.
And it's gone on, since time began, essentially?
Absolutely.
With women?
Yep.
Yeah, women and girls.
Yep.
It's time it stopped. And I know your organization has got to have had some serious roadblocks. I want to commend you for all your hard work. What has your organization been able to accomplish, and what are some of the pushbacks that you've been getting?
Sure. So, I had co-founded Run for Congo Women, raised a lot of money for women in the Congo who were survivors of violence, co-founded the first sexual violence crisis center in Mogadishu, as you mentioned. But as I sat and talked with women, you just hear over and over again, like, thank you for the support recovering, but please do what you can to end the violence. And I think every journey of activism ultimately is a journey upstream. So that's what happened for me. I learned that in international law, there are very few prohibitions around violence against women. So, explicit, legally binding prohibitions. So, for the most part, violence against women is not cemented as against human rights law, which is shocking because violence against women is the most widespread human rights violation on earth.
Oh, yeah.
And so I couldn't believe that the Convention on All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, it includes trafficking and child marriage, but beyond that, it has no mention of violence against women, nothing around domestic violence, sexual assault, anything like that. So there were calls from experts at that time for a treaty on violence against women and girls. And so we have spent the last 13 years really focused on getting nations to develop accountability for nations to take proactive steps to prevent the violence from happening, so women don't have to live through this. So we know the interventions that are effective. We've talked a little bit about the prevention education piece of it, but I'll explain a little bit more. There are sort of four main interventions that are really effective. One is strong law. So in, for instance, nations that just have a domestic violence law, not even measuring how strong it is, just a domestic violence law, 32% lower mortality rate for women. So
Yeah.
there's clearly a relationship between
Yeah.
having a law
Yeah.
and women's safety.
Yeah.
So we want really strong law for there to be just a set of standards. Secondly, though, it's better if the people who are supposed to implement the law know about it, right? So I'll give another example from Guatemala. They passed a femicide law in 2008. One of the issues that they would have, though, is sometimes they rotate their police forces every 2 years. And so new police would come into a particular area and women would come to report domestic violence and they just send them home, even though there was actually a dedicated femicide court just a couple miles down the road. They didn't know it, right? So making sure that police, judges, doctors, nurses, anyone who's coming into direct contact with survivors is familiar with the law and resources available, right? Super important. Then the third thing is services for survivors. And that's where most people have focused their attention, shelters, hotlines, that kind of thing. And then lastly, prevention education. So if you do those four things, you're going to see a drastic reduction in rates of violence against women. So what we are calling for in a treaty on violence against women is that every nation on earth would commit to implementing those interventions, as well as increased funding to end violence against women, and a scorecard, so a metrics-based reporting system so we can see exactly what every nation on earth is doing to fulfill its duty to protect women from violence. And so in terms of our journey, we did a lot of work with frontline women's rights activists first and foremost. And spent about 8 years in consultation, not really asking, do we need a treaty, but what would it need to be effective? And that's how we landed on those four things, which is very consistent with what experts around the world say. And then started talking to nations. So we've met with a lot of nations around the world, most nations around the world, to talk about the need for a global treaty, have been spearheading dialogue on that in places like Geneva and at the United Nations in New York. And so far we have had 16 nations call for an additional protocol to CEDAW, meaning it would be a treaty that is attached to the Treaty on Discrimination Against Women, that would cement into international law an end to violence against women and girls.
Bravo. Now, CEDAW. What is CEDAW?
Yeah, CEDAW is the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women.
Okay.
And so it is, in the human rights, there are sort of 9 core human rights treaties, and this is the one that relates to women. It's primarily focused on discrimination, and so right now reporting on violence against women is happening to the CEDAW committee, even though there isn't legally binding language. They've developed recommendations, like the treaty should be interpreted to include. And actually in 2017, about 5 years after we started this campaign, they introduced Recommendation 35, which outlines interventions that governments should take. It's not hard law, so to speak, but we would love to see the contents of Recommendation 35 turn into this optional protocol. Because when we compared side by side what activists around the world wanted and what's in Recommendation 35, they're nearly identical. And so what we want to do is develop Recommendation 35, which is attached to CEDAW, into this protocol to the CEDAW Convention. And, it's one of the most ratified treaties on earth. There are only 5 nations that haven't ratified it, including the United States, I will say.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a lot of buy-in to that framework. And there are lots of things we can do to strengthen that framework, while acknowledging the tremendous successes that it has shown. There have been a lot of improvements on violence against women law based on the work of the CEDAW committee so far. So definitely celebrating that, but just wanting something that's legally binding.
I love what you're doing. And
Yeah, no kidding. Wow. I'm like floored. I'm just so impressed right now.
yeah.
Well, the shocking thing really is that violence against women isn't a violation of international law. So beyond that, it's just kind of
I don't understand that. I mean, it's so it's dehumanizing. It's basically, if you allow violence against women and girls, you are basically looking at them as less than human. I mean, there are laws against abusing animals.
Yes.
I mean, I know that a lot of this is culturally ingrained, and somehow people think it's acceptable or they want to bury it. But it's the only way it's going to change is education and, yes, laws. And the fact that countries don't want to embrace this, they want it to continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I think the hard part is there's a lot of bluster around it. So no nation would say they are for violence against women. So there's a lot of chest pounding about how people want to address it. But I think the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. Like, for instance, on a funding front, right? Because you can only get these interventions, the strong law, accountability for the people implementing it, services and prevention education. You only get those things if you have money to implement them. And in 2017, 2018, the total global funding, international funding, meaning between nations to end violence against women, was only $408 million a year, which is about 11 cents per female on Earth. I mean, Kathy, you travel. Can you buy a bottle of water in Barbados for 11 cents?
No.
Oh, right. Could you buy a stick of gum there? Maybe. I don't know. Right? So it's just not serious. It's not serious. So I think we need to be real when we say, we're against violence against women and girls, that we want to see a stop to it. Okay, well, let's put our money where our mouth is, know? And honestly, I mean, given the trajectory of where we are globally right now and a lot of the changes and setbacks that are happening right now, I do find myself pondering the need for potentially doing a fundraising run series again, where women just go out and start raising the money, like we just get out and start raising the money ourselves rather than waiting for governments to do it. Because, it's just time.
Grassroots works well. That's how women got the right to vote.
Absolutely.
Yep. And it hasn't been that long that women have had the right to vote in the United States, just a little over 100 years.
Exactly.
Stay tuned for more of Women Road Warriors coming up.
Dean Michael, the tax doctor here. I have one question for you. Do you want to stop worrying about the IRS? If the answer is yes, then look no further. I've been around for years. I've helped countless people across the country, and my success rate speaks for itself. So now you know where to find good, honest help with your tax problems. What are you waiting for? If you owe more than $10,000 to the IRS or haven't filed in years, call me now at 888-557-4020 or go to mytaxhelpmd.com for a free consultation and get your life back.
Industry movement Trucking Moves America Forward is telling the story of the industry. Our safety champions, the women of trucking, independent contractors, the next generation of truckers, and more. Help us promote the best of our industry. Share your story and what you love about trucking. Share images of a moment you're proud of. And join us on social media. Learn more at truckingmovesamerica.com.
Welcome back to Women Road Warriors with Shelley Johnson and Kathy Tuccaro.
There's no excuse that violence against women and girls still exists anywhere in the world. It's a terrible cycle that poisons every society. Lisa Shannon is the co-founder of Every Woman Treaty that's working to stop the violence as a global coalition. It's important for everyone to get involved at a grassroots level to stop it, and do it country by country. It requires a village. Lisa is one of the catalysts behind these efforts in spite of the many, many roadblocks she's encountered. Lisa says it's been a journey upstream. In international law, there are very few prohibitions that stop violence against women. It's not cemented in human rights law. That has to end. Lisa's group has made tremendous strides. Her group needs more help if we can ever stop this scourge. It requires money, too. Lots of it. In 2018, the total global funding to end violence against women was about 11 cents per every woman in the world. Think about that. Lisa, what can women do? And men, for that matter. It needs to be a unified front. What can people do to help you to make change even in their own communities? I mean, there's so many places that I think could make the change.
Absolutely. I think, I feel like the right answer, the right combo pack is to find one tangible thing that you can do for a specific community. It doesn't need to be your community specifically. It can be, but for instance, I did fundraising for women in the Congo and in Somalia, right? So but having that impact on individuals while choosing one additional thing that you can do to push for systems change more broadly. So people for sure can send an email to their governments encouraging them to support the call for a treaty to end violence against women and girls. That's a very simple thing someone could do. And at the same time, looking at where they can go locally, or is there an organization who's doing great work around the world that they'd like to support? For instance, I'm not sure whether or not people are tracking the news around cuts to U.S. foreign funding right now, but there are a lot of organizations doing amazing work around the world to support survivors and get systems change at the national or local level who have just lost a tremendous amount of funding. Like aid organizations are laying off staff right now. So finding a way to donate and support or bring together a group of friends to donate and support one of these organizations would be deeply meaningful, not just in terms of the direct impact, but the signal that it sends. Like, we're going to lead. We're not going to wait for governments to do this for us. We're going to step up what we can right now and hope that governments will follow our lead, right? I think that's really important.
The grassroots level community organizations as well as churches. They do a lot of missionary work with churches and so forth. This should be a cause because when you think about it, violence against women and girls, that is a scar that continues, and it's a scar and a wound that continues to fester generation after generation. It's not good. It's not good for society. So making a change like that makes the world a whole lot better place.
Absolutely. And the work that people are doing within faith communities can be tremendous as well. So I think opening that dialogue with your own community, your church community would be a great place to start, to have that dialogue around how are we as a community communicating with our young people? Are we doing prevention education here? Are we talking about what healthy, happy relationships look like, et cetera? It could be a really powerful place to plug in.
Where are some prevention programs that you're talking about? I assume that they're around the United States. Where can people tap into that?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I think one organization I would point people to, because it's a coalition of organizations, so you could find organizations within, is Men Engage, which is an organization of groups where they really focus on the culture change for men in violence prevention, and they have partners all over the world. So if people are looking for a particular place that they could plug in, that would be really meaningful. But prevention education programs exist all over the world in many different forms. There's also one that operates in West Africa called Tostan that has done extraordinary work moving communities away from a standard practice of female genital mutilation. And it's been very effective. And in terms of smaller community organizations, I'm not sure exactly, because very often those curriculums go through, school systems, community groups, that kind of thing. So I think people would just have to do a bit of research to call around and find out.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, because it takes a village. And
yeah. Whatever happened?
It does.
If I can just ask, whatever happened to the education program that you were a part of, where you were playing
the Babylonian Encounter?
Yeah.
I'm seeing it's still there. And I think it's in Michigan.
Okay.
I think it originally started in Colorado.
Okay.
Because I hadn't thought about it until this conversation is like, is that still around? And it is. And it teaches good touch and bad touch to children. And this is good because it is making a difference.
Yeah.
And of course, that was privately funded too.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of stuff that makes the difference, so that there can be intervention, and makes the change. I mean, every little bit. But I love the programs you're talking about where, children can learn, this isn't okay. It isn't okay to do to somebody else. It isn't okay to have it done to you. And
absolutely.
Changing perspectives and cultures and ingrained thoughts, it can be real difficult. But, stopping the cycle of violence, it just makes sense. And violence against anyone isn't acceptable.
Yes. And I think if we want to end violence against anyone, start with ending violence against women and girls.
Yeah.
Because that's very often where the seeds are planted that lead to other forms of violence. Like I mentioned, even predictability around what nations will go to war is very directly linked to rates of violence against women.
That's interesting.
If people have learned the currency of violence, let's say, that's going to show up all manner of places. So if we want to end violence against anyone, and I would just argue, if we want human flourishing, we have to focus on one of the root causes, which is violence against women and girls.
It's interesting you say currency of violence. It's almost like...
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, that's well said. Wow.
Yeah. Violence, it's almost like saying people perceive violence as power.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And no, there are other ways to succeed, and it isn't by marginalizing and abusing other people. We have a warped context, and it needs to be changed. I mean, I would love to see violence against women and girls, and violence, period, eradicated. Because it's a scourge. It's really an epidemic, a pandemic that has gone on for centuries. And I love what your organization's doing, Lisa.
Well, thank you. It's been a long effort, and like I said, I think given the current landscape, we're looking closely at what we can move forward right now. For instance, getting the scorecard going now, as opposed to waiting until the treaty passes, just based on the current global climate. Looking closely at what can we move forward, what can grassroots groups move forward, independent of endorsements from nations at this point. But we do have a lot of momentum. I mean, Cote d'Ivoire and the Maldives just signed the call over the last few days.
Excellent.
Yeah. So the 16 nations that have come on board have all come on board within the last year and a half or so.
Okay.
So it's, that's after 13 years of work. So we do have momentum.
Excellent.
Right.
We need to keep that ball rolling. I want to see that happen. Lisa, how can people help your organization? Because the more the merrier.
Absolutely. Well, people can visit everywoman.org and sign the call for the global treaty. And obviously, we very much need resources right now to support frontline activists as they are raising their voices in their local contexts as well as globally to end this violence. So if people are able to donate, that's great. And then again, writing to your own government and letting them know that you would really love to see us create a treaty to end violence against women and girls, and then it's high time.
Absolutely. So people go to your website, and I see that's on your homepage, everywoman.org. It says
Yep.
join the call. So people just put
Yes.
in their name and their email, and then they can be put on the mailing list.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And we send out alerts and let people know what's happening, calls to action, et cetera. So that's a great place to plug in.
And this is something that would be good for people to talk about and say, go to everywoman.org so people can be educated on this. Education is so essential because out of sight, out of mind, I don't think people think about this and how huge the problem is.
I think people don't think about it on purpose. I think people don't think about it or talk about it because everyone has some kind of deep personal imprint from it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the shame and trauma that may be vicarious, maybe someone they know, but I think that's what's driving the silence. So the more we are able to call it out. Yeah, so that's another really important thing that everyone can do is really listen if there's someone in their life who's been through this. Really listen, and if you've been through it yourself, reach out and get some support to heal it. The post-traumatic stress is real, and not just from physical violence, but the very often survivors will say the emotional violence leaves an even deeper scar,
It
and
does.
it can.
Oh, it does.
I mean, that thing, I
can-
think, Kathy, is, as you were talking about before we started our conversation now, that healing, just the imprint of who you think you are, being told that you're worthless, for such a long time, and then completely changing or transforming your self-concept. That is its own act of defiance. That's its own act of resistance. That is absolutely so important for thinking about how we transform this globally, doing that work for yourself or supporting someone in your life. I have a friend I'll mention. She was a survivor of abuse when she was younger. And, when she was much younger, and then in her 20s, she left that situation and ended up on a different track. I won't mention who it is, but I will say she went on to create a company that went public over the last few years for about $4.5 billion.
Wow.
So it's interesting how abusers want to tell us who we are and what we're capable of in the world, and they don't have any idea.
No, they
So
don't.
I know.
have to tap into our own power for transformation.
That's right.
And then share that, right? I think combating, our thoughts aren't real. They're just thoughts, right? And so much of what we've been raised in, kind of swimming in patriarchy, we have these thoughts that are just regurgitations of what we've been swimming in our whole lives. So being able to really address that and transform and choose the thoughts that we want to be having about ourselves, and really defining for ourselves based on our own values who we are, is incredibly important work, and should never be diminished as a huge part of societal transformation and culture change.
Absolutely. I see on your website, Lisa, you also have a take action page. It's really informative for people to join the call. There's a link for you can send a letter to your government, join your coalition, or donate. So that's everywoman.org/take action. I highly recommend people check that out too. I want to encourage people to get involved. I hope we're motivating listeners because every little bit is going to make the change. And you've really, after 13 years worth of work, you're really gaining the momentum. It's taken quite a while. We need to keep that momentum going.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
And it takes a global outcry. So joining the call is joining that global outcry, and it could not be more important than it is today.
We need to all scream.
Yes.
Very loudly. Yes. Oh, I love this. Thank you for sharing what you're doing and educating our listeners. I think sometimes people need to be reminded.
Absolutely.
And if people aren't motivated after this interview, I hope they are.
Well, thank you.
I'm pretty sure they will be. I'm motivated. I'm like, all right, let's go.
Yeah, me
Let's
too.
do it. Stand
Yeah.
back.
Yeah.
Yes.
Love it. Well, just thank you for everything that you're doing to raise your voices and change culture and change what's considered normal by being the just loud, open, bold voices for change. It just means the world.
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, we're all about empowering women, and this is part of it. And
Yes.
thank you for what you're doing, Lisa. You're a godsend. This is
Yes.
just what
Thank you.
society needs, you know? Yeah,
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed. We'll just keep making progress.
that's right. That will happen. Thank you, Lisa, for sharing with us. We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode. And if you want to hear more episodes of Women Road Warriors or learn more about our show, be sure to check out womenroadwarriors.com. And please follow us on social media. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. On our website, we also have a selection of podcasts just for women. There are a series of podcasts from different podcasters. So if you're in the mood for women's podcasts, just click the Power Network tab on womenroadwarriors.com. You'll have a variety of shows to listen to anytime you want to. Podcasts made for women. Women Road Warriors is on all the major podcast channels like Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Audible, YouTube, and others. Check us out. And please follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Women Road Warriors with Shelley Johnson and Kathy Tuccaro. If you want to be a guest on the show or have a topic or feedback, email us at sjohnson@womenroadwarriors.com.